and performance and love and race. And for Baldwin, it was already assumed that there was nothing natural about race, that race was culturally associated, that racial identity emerged from a social cultural fabric. So when he looks at race, he looks at it in these multiple ways: culture, the existential, the phenomenological. And then, of course, he attempts through the novel to draw important conclusions about how America would have to change. Now, one of the things he makes abundantly clear is that the problem for America and for humanity is whiteness. And he would ultimately say that as white people, quote, white people would never be human. That whiteness was constructed as a mechanism to make possible and to sustain and produce and reproduce white privilege and white supremacy. Without white privilege, no one would have to be white. And so if there is whiteness, of course, there is its opposite, blackness. And since whiteness only exists as the opposite or negation of blackness, and since whiteness was deserving, this was not privilege, it's not white skin privilege, it was those who deserved getting what they deserved. It was not a privilege. And hence, you know, this kind of naturalization of whiteness, as though, well, we've always been white. And we have always been superior. Baldwin undercuts that. He says whiteness is the opposite of blackness. If there were not black people, you wouldn't need whiteness. But then blackness is construed as the negation of all human values. You know, that's why today black life is devalued. And there is the assumption among large numbers of white people that this would really be a great country if we could get rid of the black people. And of course, you see it in these police murders, in the mass incarceration, and in gentrification. If you want to have a good neighborhood, if you want to develop the area around Temple, you have to get rid of black people. We don't even want to see that. So there's the devaluation, and it's based upon the notion that blackness is the negation of all human values. So we see this working through Baldwin's novels. But of course, for Baldwin, people are not just their racial identities or their racial existences. And black people love, black people aspire and strive, black people find ways to exist in a society that is always hostile towards them. Now, on the 3rd of December, which will be the last one, we want to investigate what I'm calling the spiritual life world of the African American people. By spiritual, I don't mean only religion or mainly religion. You know, I was up at Riverside Church over the weekend at this great event, which I thought was going to be a great event, where Cornel West and Bob Avakian were going to discuss religion and revolution. A provocative and important discussion, probably maybe a little late in America. It's happened decades ago in Latin America and other places. But so, you know, it's a great turnout in the great Riverside Chapel, anointed and sanctified by Martin Luther King's great speech. Although the Rockefellers built it, King sanctified it. Sanctified me, purified. Yeah. I'll get back to that. That's a black thing. Black spiritual life. King made that chapel immortal. So all of this great anticipation, and Bob Avakian blew the whole thing. I didn't know that. The guy talked for 2 straight hours and only stopped when the audience started demanding that he give Cornel equal time. Cornel spoke in 20 minutes and said more than he did in 2 hours. But what became apparent to me is that while Avakian and his party recognized the central role of the African American people in the resistance to the 1% and to the forces of war and fascism in this country, and he spoke to that and so on quite well. But it was apparent that he knows nothing about black people, because the way he set it up, black folks' religion was in opposition to their striving for freedom. You know, it's kind of like he dogmatically took the statement in Karl Marx that religion is the opiate of the people. And he was right if you were in Europe in the 19th century. But when you talk about the African American people, you are talking about this complex spiritual life, which includes the totality of their creative and transcendent intellectual and artistic and aesthetic energy. And so on the 3rd, we're going to demonstrate that from music. And if you know anything about black music and black art, besides freedom, perhaps the most enduring thing is love. The love of God, which could be interpreted in multiple ways. John Coltrane would call it a love supreme. The tragic love, which is also a part of the love of God, which Dubois called the sorrow songs, which we call gospel, and the secularized form being the blues, which is the foundation musically and aesthetically of black music and art and dance. You want to understand what is unique in black art, you have to know the blues, what Du Bois called the rhythmic narrative of a disappointed people. People for whom the world is not always a pleasant place. You're always prepared to be disappointed, to be sold out, to be betrayed. And so the history of America for black people is a history of betrayal. Victory and then betrayal. Civil rights and then white backlash. Civil war and reconstruction and then the betrayal, the compromise that sold out black people. So the rhythmic narrative, so you have the tragic love, the blues, Then you have the revolutionary love of the people. You get that in Sly Stone. You get that in, I think most magnificently, in the popular form, Curtis Mayfield. We people who are darker than blue. Curtis. You get that in Stevie Wonder and others. The revolutionary love of the people. The great modern jazz tradition. You want to know the difference between black jazz and non-black jazz? If you can hear it, you hear that music of revolution, of challenge. John Coltrane, Charlie Parker. I could go on. And then, of course, finally, we could do all of this on the third. The black romantic ideal. This emerges at a unique period in black history. This comes out of the civil rights, black power, and black arts, and black is beautiful movements. And therefore, you finally hear black men and women talking to each other about their beauty, how much we love you. And you know, of course, when you get the figure that goes through it all, of course, is Aretha Franklin, who is the only one that you have to put up there with like Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald and Sarah Vaughan and Dinah Washington. Aretha Franklin. She does it all, but she goes into the love, the romantic idea of course, my favorite is Teddy Pendergrass, who is clearly singing to a black woman. And he's singing about his love for her. And that had never occurred in black music, black romantic ideal. We'll go through all of that. So I got these 5 forms of love that define black aesthetics and black art and black music. But it occurred to me that if they can, with all of this passion, maybe it was fake, for the black struggle and his outrage at Ferguson and other crimes against black folks, does not know black people. Black people, for him, as for many movements and theorists and ideologists outside of the black lived world, see black people as that battering ram to weaken the walls and institutions of oppression to make it possible for other people to walk in the door. And then look back at black people who did the heavy lifting and have every critique of every movement and every individual, as though if it were not for black people, you wouldn't have the job in the university for which you critique black people in the black movement. Does that make sense? So this idea of the utility and functionality of the black movement is to either make white life more civilized or to create conditions for a reconfigurated common whiteness. The great example of this is affirmative action. In institutions that had historically and intentionally excluded black people Coming out of the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act of '64, it was said that if federal money was involved, for example, in supporting a university, or state money. Of course, when you say federal money, that's not just white money. Black people pay taxes. Even when their citizenship was second or third class, we still pay taxes, and probably paid higher taxes than most other people. But the very institutions that fed at the trough of taxpayers' money excluded black people. So coming out of the Civil Rights Movement and basing itself on the 14th Amendment was argued that these institutions had to show good faith, and affirmative action was the modality of doing that. Of course, you have the inevitable white backlash against affirmative action. Not for everybody, but for black folks. It was not an anti-gender affirmative action, and going forward, not even anti-sexuality and sexual identity affirmative action. It was anti-black affirmative action, because the assumption was, two assumptions. One, black people are undeserving. And of course, we always play the race card, since we're undeserving. And we want you black people to be judged on the content of your character. The other assumption was that this is a white nation. The democracy is a white democracy, a term called Ellen vote democracy, a superior race democracy. And therefore, if anything, these movements, even the movements that you people were in the forefront of, improve democracy, which is to be read, expanding the boundaries of a common whiteness. This notion that black people do not deserve the fruits of the resistance is deeply rooted in this idea that the best that black people can offer, quote, us, is their bodies. And after that, will make black people are very aware of that, and so was Baldwin. And so he saw what Avakian and others could not see. Many people interpret black art, black spiritual and religious practices as some kind of childish thing. You go to a sanctified church. If you don't know what you're going into, you say, who are these primitive people shouting and falling on the floor? The ecstasy, which, by the way, I can just say this. You want to understand black art and black music, you want to understand culture, don't just see the first part of my favorite things where he plays the melodic line. You really know Coltrane when you get to the part of the ecstatic, the ecstasy, the transcendence, the beyond what is now to the perception and the attempt to live the possibility of the future. That's why Sun Ra said, I'm not from here. And space is the place. If you really want to understand the here and now, you have to get beyond the here and now. So this is very rooted. This spiritual life, this ecstasy, this ecstaticness. And of course, when we, on the third, which I can't wait for, I'll get involved in this. I can't wait for it. Because you will see it. Not just listening to what they said, let's show YouTube. Look at Aretha Franklin. Look at how she is transformed and how she reaches that spiritual height, which is neither quantifiable nor explainable using rational methods, or, as my friend Father Baldwin said, scientific method. This is not science, though. This is something else. So, look now, Baldwin. Baldwin was born in 1924 in Harlem, New York. He didn't know his biological father, but his father in every sense except biology was the husband to his mother and the father to him and the siblings that would follow. Baldwin's mother was from Maryland and his father was from New Orleans. His father was something of a minister. His father actually hated himself and hated Baldwin. Baldwin was this unusual physical specimen, as you can see, defined by his eyes. And his father always called Baldwin ugly because of the eyes. He obviously does not fit the European physical ideal of beauty. But he does look like an African mask. And he would early on, especially in a very important essay, long 100-page essay, by the way, entitled, "The Devil Has Work." He says that early on in his life, he said, "I will transform that which people say is my ugliness into a weapon." And so, at a very young age, it's quite extraordinary. He comes to terms with what his life will be, what his life is, and what it would be like living in his body with his brain. He is black, and he is, according to all European and American standards, ugly. His father had said to him, "Those eyes are what makes you ugly." And Baldwin would comment, "Well, if he thought that I was ugly and that my eyes made me ugly, since my mother and I look alike, he obviously thinks that my mother is ugly." Now, Baldwin, because his father was a preacher in probably what was a storefront church, a sanctified church, what back in the days they would call holy and sanctified. This is not the religion of the book. This is the religion of experience. This is the religion of ecstasy. This is the religion of transcendental experiential life. It's something that only those who are into it understand. In the holy and sanctified church, they are not reverent and quiet. They are irreverent and loud. That's why all the great singers and musicians come out of the church. And speaking in tongues and shouting and falling on the floor and making a joyous and joyful noise with tambourines and drums and other instruments. And it got so good that the man known as Sweet Daddy Grace, who formed, and this is very important, in the midst of great segregation and oppression of black people. The most segregated time of the week is on Sunday during church hour. People who claim one God and followers of one God were separated on the basis of race. The black church movement was different. Sweet, sweet Daddy Grace. Just Daddy Grace. His followers called him sweet. They got so sweet they had to say sweet, sweet Daddy Grace. By the way, is an immigrant from the Cape Verde Islands, where my dad is from. He formed a church known as the United House of Prayer for all people. Suffering segregation. This is a house of prayer for all people. And in the United House of Prayer for all people, they felt that the trombone was the instrument that best spoke to God. So if you go to the United House of Prayer for all people, they have about 4 or 5 trombonists kicking. In fact, I had a white student here at Temple who was a trombonist in the United House of Prayer, just affectionately called the House. The House. So, but of course, that defines the African American people, seen as primitive, can be dismissed, not serious, childlike, is in fact the very opposite. It is the achievement of the highest human quality to go beyond the individual, to the collective, and to what King called the cosmic partnership. Recognition that we're all part of common destiny, whether that's one directly affects us all. And so when black people play and perform their religious and spiritual lives, it is not childlike. It's quite advanced and ultimately profoundly human. Civilized in a way that white America cannot understand. And in fact, wishes to appropriate, commodify, and make money off of. But anyway. But without this recognition of black people and how we live, how we feel, how we talk, how we love, romantically, religiously, revolutionary love, you can't begin to understand us because you cannot hear our voices. Now, for Baldwin, it was art that manifested the great spiritual life of the African American people. I would like to just read you something that he said about the role of the artist. Now, let me just set it up like this. You know, Baldwin, from the time he was very young, was openly gay. He was a child preacher, like Teddy Pendergrass was. Go on. You know, I'll teach you that. He was a child preacher from 14 to 17. When he graduates from high school, he leaves his father's house, he leaves the church, never to return to institutionalized religion, and moves to the village, Greenwich Village, and ultimately in 1948 leaves the United States and goes to Paris with a one-way ticket. But he was openly gay. His mentor in high school was a man by the name of Cunty Cullen, a Harlem Renaissance poet and literary figure, who was also W.E.B. Du Bois's daughter's first husband, Yolanda's first husband. And the marriage lasted about 6 months. Because after 6 months, Cunty Cullen came out, I'm gay. I'm not feeling you like that. Now that was not necessarily an obstacle, because there are many marriages where one or both parties are gay and they live heterosexually for the public. And that's a fascinating thing in and of itself. However, for the daughter of Du Bois, that was not accepted. Not for positive reasons either. Because, well, so they divorced. But yet, Cunty Cullen was teaching at Frederick Douglass High School, where Baldwin went to high school, and he was one of Baldwin's mentors, and such. So Baldwin was openly gay. In a lot of ways, it was hard for Baldwin to hide his sexuality. So by the time the revolutionary 60s hit, you have the Black Power revolutionaries, many of whom felt that revolution, as James Brown said, is a man's thing. This is a man's world. If you're going to be a revolutionary, you got to be a man in this sense of what the American society defines as manhood. And we, black men, are going to teach the white man a lesson. Well, that's well and good in a certain way. But when it came to there were many in the Black revolutionary movement questioned his authenticity and his blackness based upon his homosexuality. And the famous writer, essayist, prison writer, Elbridge Cleaver, leader of the Black Panther, one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party, wrote in his famous book, Soul on Ice, that Baldwin was not a real black man, that he was really bourgeois and a tool of the white establishment. And Baldwin, in an essay called To Be Baptized, famously said, in the most gracious and gentle way, to Cleveland, I don't know what your experiences in prison were. I'm using Baldwin words. I am not that sissy that you experienced in prison. But what you meant, I'm not one of those people who perform their sexuality based on the fact that they've been broken on the wheel of life. Our sexuality is about my private life. I don't make it a public issue. And then he went on to say to me, what you have to understand is that the artist and the revolutionary share very much in common. He said both of us more than not find ourselves on the margins of ordinary society. And then he would write in another place, because Baldwin, pretty much from the time that he was a teenager, I'm talking about 13 and 14, saw himself as an intellectual and decided he wanted to be a writer. He graduates from high school, by the way, he did not go to college. And this is very important. I don't want to keep going back. But you know, this other famous black leader named William Monroe Trump. He was one of the second or third black people to graduate from Harvard. When he reflected after coming to Harvard years, he said Harvard has destroyed more good black minds than bad listeners. So by Baldwin perhaps not going to NYU or Columbia or anywhere else, probably saved his intellectual life for us in the future. But he would say of the artist, and I quote, "The role of the artist is exactly the same as the role of the lover. If I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't know." Maybe that's the way we should all go into our love affairs. You know? But then he also says that that is the same as the role of the revolutionary. It is what Newton would call revolutionary love of the people. If I love the people, I wish to make them conscious of that which they do not know. When Huey, for example, would speak of revolutionary suicide, by which he meant not physical suicide, but a type of sacrifice of your individual self, he was talking about something very similar to what Baldwin was talking about. Now, one of the other people who in the period when he was, quote, a cultural nationalist, who also misunderstood and attacked Baldwin's homosexuality, was Amiri Baraka. As a follower of the Kawaida doctrine of Maulana Khomeini, which mythologized an Africa which never existed and will never exist. An Africa without class conflict, an Africa without inequality, an Africa, as many put it, without homosexuality. To which you ask the question, well, how did you know that? And the answer is usually, there is no word for homosexuality in any African language. But then the next thing comes, well, last I looked, there were 1,500 languages in Africa. You know, Africa is the linguistic mother of the world. In fact, linguists make the argument that there are 7, some would say perhaps 24, languages that are the mother tongue foundation of all of human language. But should we be surprised? Because what makes us human, according to population geneticists, is the fact that every human being that is human carries African genes, irrespective of what your phenotype is. If there are not African genes in your DNA, you are not human. And hence, the linguistic mother of all languages, the mother tongue, are 7 African languages. And in 1,500 languages, these are not dialects, these are languages with specific vocabularies and grammars. So unless you know all of those languages, how can you say that they have no word for homosexuality? But then even when you go beyond that, do you know, or have you or anybody you know done the anthropological research into the sexual practices of the multiple communities of Africans? Or is your African African, some essentialized, mythologized, never to exist trope to justify a certain ideological perspective. Well, I think it is that. So, Amiri, the great Amiri Baraka, second only to Baldwin in the literary life for Black folk and the nation, in this period of the mid-60s to around 1974, was a cultural nationalist. And for him, with all his brilliance, he adopted this African essentialism. In some ways, there's some roots to it. It goes back to maybe Sangoma, that was what we'll talk about later, and the negritude movement among African students in Paris at the time. So he, there's some, this, that we, to feel good about ourselves, we must have a mythology of our Africanity. So it was anti-homosexual, although one of his daughters. That's the problem with homophobia. So I hate gays, but you hate your gay cousin. About your gay child. Yes, it's a difficult thing. Yeah, it has no boundaries. It had no boundaries. So, and then he attacked Baldwin, even though Amiri would admit to having homosexual relationships at the time that he lived in the village. Maybe the same way for Eldridge Cleveland at the time he lived in the penitentiary. But nonetheless, he had that position. And of course, Baldwin suffered under the critique, unjustified, of him personally, and the attempt, almost in an Oedipal sense, of the son wanting to slay the father so that he could have the mother, Yes. But then, Amiri, around 1972-73, abandons this cultural nationalism and becomes suddenly a revolutionary communist. Nothing had ever happened like that, such a 180-degree shift, I don't think, in the history of the Black intelligentsia. I mean, it was no kind of transition. He abandons it, and he moves forward now as a communist and a Maoist. But in these early days and years, Amiri's Marxism is very infantile. Amiri is always a genius. Always. But his Marxism had this infantile, performative, rhetorical character. It was language for him, I think. But then, Amiri, to move beyond this narrow sectarian revolutionary theories, has to go back to what are his roots. Where's his roots? Jimmy Baldwin. So Jimmy Baldwin dies in 1987. One of the people who eulogized him at St. John the Divine Church in Harlem was Amiri Baraka. And I just like to read to you merely saved. And I contend that it was with the return to Baldwin that Baraka's Marxism and communism becomes black and it becomes human in a way that it is not. This is important. And then he says this. This man traveled the earth like its history and its biography. He reported, criticized, made beautiful, analyzed, cajoled, lyricized, attacked, sang, made us better, made us consciously human, or perhaps more acidly pre-human. He was spirit because he was living. And even past this tragic hour when we weep, he has gone away. And why, we keep asking. There's mountains of evil creatures who we would willingly bid farewell to, like Bob Ray. Jimmy could have given you some of their names on demand. We curse our luck, our oppressors, our age, our weakness. Why and why again? And why can drive you mad, or said enough times might even make you wise. Yet this why in us is in him as well. Jimmy was wise from asking whys. W-H-Y-S. Mary's giving us his whys and his whys, W-H-Y-S, to go with our own, to make them into a larger why, W-H-Y, and a deeper why. And it's a question which makes us wise, and that the objective knowledge is not on to show off, but why, W-I-S-E, asking why, W-H-Y-S. Jimmy's spirit, which will be with us as long as we remember ourselves, is the only truth which keeps us sane and changes our whys to wiseness. It is his spirit, spirit of the little black first ancestor, which we feel. Those of us who really felt it, we know this spirit will be with us quote, as long as the sun shines and the water flows, end quote. For his is the spirit of the life thrilling to its own consciousness. Let me read that sentence again. For his is the spirit of life thrilling to its own consciousness. His spirit is part of our own. It is our feelings completion. It is our feelings completion. I want to come back to all these. Our perceptions extension. The edge of our rationale. The paradigm for our best use of this world. And I would highly recommend it to you in this book, because you can see the great depth of Miri Baraka paying homage to his, so to speak, spiritual and intellectual father, James Baldwin. Significance of this is that Amiri, and I agree with him, places Baldwin at the foundation and the spearhead of black intellectual life. Baldwin was a socialist, but not a Marxist. Baldwin was a self-identified revolutionary. He says, that of himself.
Right.
And here you have Amiri Baraka, the Marxist, Maoist communist, having to acknowledge his debt to Jimmy Baldwin. But then again, we return to spirit. The spiritual life world of the African American is exposed in the writings of Jimmy Baldwin. And so our consciousness of who we are and what we might be, according to Amiri Baraka, is found in James Baldwin. I mean, that's saying quite a bit. And I just this part, and thus we have the spiritually most advanced people, African Americans. The spiritual level is manifested in art. How else is the spirit of people manifested? Great art is a manifestation of a great spiritual life. The soul life, the interior life, the artistic and poetic life, not the rational life. That's the kindergarten. We're talking about graduate school of humanity.
Yeah.
Is manifested in these other sciences. See what I'm saying? And thus it is the spirituals, the sorrow songs, the blues, that measures the human quality of the African American. Not whether or not you got the highest grade on the SAT, or your white 5th grade teacher thought you were smart. It is not the judgment of white America that counts. It is your own consciousness of who you are that will make the difference. And hence, Amiri says, Baldwin taught us. He brought us to a consciousness of who we are. And ultimately, the rest of Amiri Baraka's life would have new and deeper meaning and significance because he was able to reconnect to Jimmy Baldwin. Now, just a small thing on Amiri Baraka. Amiri Baraka is not only the greatest poet, one of the greatest playwrights, certainly the greatest American and world probably critic of jazz. When I say critic, I mean investigator, explainer, knowledgeable of jazz. After this encounter with Baldwin, Amiri would proclaim the necessity and inevitability of cultural revolution and class struggle. That for Amiri, he wished to bring that new generation of avant-garde jazz musicians to the radical class struggle perspective, and hence to make jazz that vehicle to confront this rising and selfish and myopic black bourgeoisie in the interest of the liberation of the masses. Now, let me just do quickly some things. There are 3 essays that books of essays and essays that I highly recommend, and upon which the rest of what I'm going to say is based. One is his chronicling of the first conference of African and Black writers and artists held in September of 1956 in Paris. This was a conference of artists and writers on the cusp of the great independence movements in Africa. The period of, let us say, 1945, after World War II, when you have the first Pan-African Congress, up to, pardon me, the fifth Pan-African Congress, up to 1975, with the collapse of the Portuguese fascist colonial regime, and hence the liberation of Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and Sao Tome, opening up the door militarily and politically for the final advance on the apartheid regime in South Africa. So we're looking at a almost 30-year period of resistance. The Writers' Conference comes almost at the, not quite the midpoint, but at a significant turning point in this process. It was a year after the Afro-Asiatic Conference held in Indonesia in a small town known as Bandung. It is known in history as the Bandung Conference. The organizers of this conference referred to it as the Second Bandung. And in many ways, it was Africa and its writers and intellectuals confronting European civilization and European culture, as well as themselves. It emerges in a lot of ways out of two strains or two movements within the movement founded in 1930 known as the Negritude movement, the Black movement in Paris by two people, Aimé Césaire of Martinique, the great writer and communist, and Léopold Senghor, who became the first president of Senegal. They were the founders of Negritude. They were influenced by the Harlem Renaissance. It was a Black arts movement. So when they meet 26 years later in Paris, we see the two strains of Negritude or Blackness. The conservative, cultural, nationalist form, Senghor, and the revolutionary form, Aimé Césaire. George Lamming from Jamaica, Elon Diop, the great writer, Senegalese writer, and of course, Cheikh Anta Diop. But there was also an American delegation there. There was Horace Mann Bond, Julian Bond's father, and I can't remember the other names right off the top of my head. But Du Bois would write a letter to the conference and in effect say that any American Negro that the State Department allowed out of the country to come to that conference should not be trusted. Which heightened the already suspicious attitude that the Africans had about African Americans. They were viewed as suspicious and part of the State Department. Now, Richard Wright, who was also part of the delegation and a great American writer, and also a communist at one time, had kind of gone completely over to the State Department and was touting the State Department line. So the American delegation was under suspicion to start out with, and Du Bois's letter to the conference didn't help matters. But nonetheless, Baldwin, in this great essay, demonstrates this moment of birth of what would become the African intelligentsia in the moment of independence. He thought highly of Aimé Césaire, the poet, the writer, the playwright. He didn't think much of Richard Wright. He thought a lot of the Jamaican writer, George Lamming. He indicates that Cheikh Anta Diop, the anthropologist who theorized the two cradles theories of human civilization, he talked about how great a success he was. But at the end of the essay, Baldwin indicates that the African intelligentsia could not be comforted in some kind of mythology of the past. That for Africa, the future was the future. That history was not the past, but the future. Mm-hmm. And that unless in independence and so on, the African intelligentsia could work out and resolve the profound problems of creating a new culture of Africa, not in civilizational warfare with Europe and Asia, but of taking the best of all human creation to produce this vanguard civilization of intelligence. That was 1956. It is one of the great political essays of our time, and it should be read as such. But then in 1971, he publishes a book of two essays entitled No Name in the Street. The first essay is entitled Take Me to the Water, and the second essay is entitled To Be Baptized. He left the church, but he never left the Bible. And in this essay, he confronts in 1971, Malcolm had been assassinated, Martin had been assassinated, Medgar Evers had been assassinated, civil rights acts had been passed, laws had been changed, but Americans had not changed. It was America with different laws, which meant that those laws would never be enforced and would be interpreted and reinterpreted infinitely until there was nothing left protecting the citizenship and right to vote of African Americans. Without America changing, the change of laws meant very, very little. So Baldwin backs up and he looks at America anew. And what he discovers is that black folk will pretty much have to survive and fight on their own. That white America was culturally, politically, ideologically consumed by their whiteness, obsessed, I should say, with their whiteness. Arrogant, egotistical. We are the great democracy, the beacon of freedom, and by we they meant white folk. That we have a right to bomb, to occupy, to kill. Those are our God-given rights. Baldwin would argue that such a people and such a culture could never free anyone and would always understand their privilege in terms that gave them the right to oppress, kill, and imprison black people. What Baldwin argues is that this is not just mistaken policy, or even a mistake. This was a matter of ontology, of being, of existence itself. In a certain sense, a zero-sum game. Not the mutuality that Martin Luther King preached, but a zero-sum game. Anything black people get means a loss to white people. If not in material sense, in psychological ways. Black assertiveness, black achievement, the black voice itself, parentheses, my problem here, is seen as adversarial to and a psychological loss for white people. Black people could be unemployed. We could have 100% unemployment, 100% poverty. But if one black man or woman stands up and protests, that is seen as an injury to the collective psyche and institutions of white folk. That's Baldwin, that's not me. Talking about speaking truth to power and truth to ignorance. I mean, it never got sharper than that. And so he looked to the new currents of revolutionary change, to Huey P. Newton and the Black Panther Party, to Angela Davis, to the young revolutionaries, that it would not be gradual. Change in America could not be gradual. The avenues of reform would be only mechanisms to quiet black people, to make white people feel, oh, we've done all we can for black people, to expand the parameters of a common whiteness, to reinvent whiteness. But reform never would serve the purpose of advancing black people. Of course, you will have the black millionaire class, now billionaire class, that will be trotted all around the world and kept on television to say, look, these are good Negroes. And if the rest of you all would learn from them, you'd be better off. Now, of course, one of those good Negroes was Bill Cosby.
That's right. You see what happened.
And now we know about him. So much for good Negroes. Because they also have a secret and alternative life that, whatever. But he agreed with Huey Newton. And he would say, like Huey Newton, I'm a socialist.
Right.
That Huey Newton's theory of revolutionary change had to be taken seriously. That the Black Panther Party would pay a heavy price for standing up. That white America would see them as the ultimate insult to whiteness. Not just speaking up, but speaking up armed with guns. So he looked to Newton. He looked to the possibility of real revolutionary change. But what happens in the meantime? What Baldwin would call the long meantime. This period of this drawn out counter-revolution. What would happen? How would black people survive this winter? This winter in America. How would we survive it? And so he said, political organization and art. He opposed, Baldwin would, the integrated, apologistic black bourgeoisie that comes out of the civil rights movement appropriates the benefits of the civil rights movement, get elected to mayoral and congressional and state legislative positions, now president,
That's right.
and be appointed to university boards of trustees, boards of directors of major corporations, and would even be, and I put quotes, spokesman for white America.
Right.
Baldwin theorized that the black movement must separate itself from this bourgeois class, whose only function is to uphold white supremacy and be apologist for it. Thus the return to the spiritual life world of art, music, and dance. For Baldwin, we could not allow it to be perverted or polluted by the interest of capitalism. That's obvious. A big part of what we call black popular culture has been taken over. And it's thrown back in our faces. Now what you gonna say?
Right.
We took the best you got, your art, and it belongs to us. And you know, like people like Daoud and myself, who saw the evolving of this great culture, at least from the period of the 60s forward, are uncomfortable with what we see around us. A celebrity culture, sellouts, perpetrators. Like Cornel West said, I agree with him completely. When you take the love train,
Right.
out of the black life world, when you don't have a Marvin Gaye or the Emotions or Patti LaBelle or Aretha or Donny Hathaway saying to a black man or woman, I love you, ebony woman, you know, Teddy Penn, come on and go with me. Come on over to my house. You don't have to feel pressure. You understand what I'm saying? If it is turned into its opposite, there's no longer black culture. It is its opposite. It is corporate, anti-black culture performed by black people, worse than the worst minstrel show, than the worst Step and Fetch It, Man Tan Moreland, the Bronze Buckaroos, inventions of a Hollywood racist machine. Worse than even that. So Baldwin said it is art. It is the spiritual life. He will ultimately say, in another very, very long essay that has 3 chapters, by the way. So his essays are more than essays. Called The Devil Has Work. He will talk about, in the most unbelievable way, the development of his own creative imagination in struggle and conflict with the images of white Hollywood pop culture that he experienced in the movies. And he talks about, you know, these Hollywood stars, and then he talks about Betty Davis, who was, quote, ugly like him, and his mother, quote, ugly. and how in those spaces of interrogation of white aesthetic racial values, he found his own aesthetic and his own calling. And so he is constantly, in all of his writings, talking about this division between the white world and the black spiritual life. And in this long essay, he talks a lot about movies and novels and The Tale of Two Cities. He talks about Dostoevsky and Crime and Punishment, the Russian novels. But then he talks about an interesting novel that was popular in France. The movie was made. And the plot of the novel is a very light-skinned black man who could pass for white, who sees his darker-skinned brother killed by white men, or finds his darker-skinned brother killed, lynched by white in the South. And this black man decides that he will get revenge. And Baldwin pays a great deal of attention to the concept of revenge. And he does a big discussion of that. And revenge in the white mind. You know, the idea, always, white people on guard, we've got to get revenge for what these Negroes have done to our country. It's been said. But this black man is going to reverse it. He's going to get revenge. And how does he get revenge? He will get revenge by sleeping with and then murdering any number of white women. Fantastic story. And Baldwin says, not a very well-written novel, but it tells an important story about something in black folk, maybe even something in Baldwin. What would I do? Take Mike Brown. Without a mass movement, and I was going to settle accounts with the white world on my own. Now, in the Jim Crow period, and I guess we're still in Jim Crow to a certain extent, where the greatest crime a black man could commit was to, quote, rape a white woman. Now, we should know that any form of sex with a white woman was defined as rape. Because for a white woman to have sex with a black man, she had to be either completely crazy or raped. So the anti-miscegenation laws, anti-mixed marriage law, were always in place because no white woman would want to have sex with a black man. And so the Scottsboro case of the mid-1930s, where these 9 young men were accused of raping a white woman, or the other cases. One of the things that the white South hated about the civil rights movement was it was black and white women marching alongside of black men. The great martyr of the civil rights movement, Viola Liuzzo, seldom spoken of, killed in 1965 in Alabama while she was helping black people register to vote. Even to this day, people believe, well, she was just down there to have sex with black men. Even on the freedom rides, the white South would be even more vicious to white people, often than the black people. They saw them as race traitors, and they saw them as creating conditions for black men to have sex with white women. Now, it's never black women having sex with white men.
Right, that's never
because
considered.
That's the patriarchy.
That's never considered.
That is the patriarchy. I'm going to get to that.
you talked about that, the inverted patriarchy. So-called black is really an inverted patriarchy. But we'll ask me a question. So, the patriot, that we are protecting our white women from the black out of control savage. Now, so what does he do? He violates all of the taboos. He penetrates the depth of white male consciousness. And what it's kind of a pornographic in the soft porno sense, because it talks about this taboo. And so he makes it simple. What does Paul say? Ultimately, the guy is caught and he's executed. Has to be executed. But not only is he executed, his genitalia are cut off. And that's always to show we've got it. That's part of the deal. The white police force is to protect white women. Omia, you, quote, kill our front line of defense of white women. Now you must die. Because if we don't have this white police force, and have no mistake about it, Philadelphia police force is a white institution. Better yet, a white racist institution. If you don't believe me, come with me down the Reading Terminal in the morning. And I'm telling you, look at those white guys.
You'll see it.
And yes. And I'll tell you this, they're not on the police force to serve and protect. They're on the police force to get to some niggas. You understand? So it's a white police force, Mumia. And then when you have not emasculated, when you have not destroyed his voice, now we're going to pass a law to protect Maureen Faulkner, the white virgin, from this black man's voice. Let me end here. This is so much to talk about. I just say this. So much to talk about. We have to recover Jimmy Baldwin. He emerges in the middle of the 20th century, but he is more significant in the 21st century. Baldwin perhaps gives us the framework of most of what we need intellectually to move forward at this time. I think, like with the case of Amiri Baraka, there are multiple ideologies of the modern world, many of which are very important and significant. And they must be, one could be a Marxist, one could be a feminist, one could be a nationalist, one could be whatever she or he thinks best appropriates and advances the struggle for black freedom, which is the spearhead and the necessary foundation of all progress in this country. It is not by mistake that in resistance, black folk have in the past, at this moment, and will in the future do most of the heavy lifting. We can't get it mistaken. It is black folk who have done the heavy lifting in the struggle for the freedom of America. That in this moment, no matter what ideological stance you take, there is a foundation that gives meaning and greater clarity to whatever ideological stance you have. And I think it is in thinkers like Jimmy Baldwin. It is not a side question. Oh, I'm reading Marx's Das Kapital. Well, I'll have time to get to Baldwin later on. I think it's the opposite. Read Baldwin and then Marx's Das Kapital. You see what I'm saying? I'm reading, someone said, I'm reading such and such, I'm reading Mao Zedong, like my friend Bob said. That's all good, no problem. And he said, Mao is the greatest revolutionary of the 20th century, whatever that meant to him. But money, if you want to talk about the here and now and the future as history, I think you need Baldwin. That's my case. Thank you very, very much. But I don't think I have a chance to talk about Baldwin like this again. So I appreciate y'all's time. Maybe somebody wants to ask a question. Yes. Pam Africa, the great
right.
Pam Africa. Yes.
In the beginning with the fight with the FOP and Daniel Faulkner, they were completely losing like they are now. But what they did, they went and they pulled Maureen up. Maureen was not involved in the
Right.
beginning.
In the beginning, she wasn't involved. Right.
Right. When we did the books in 95, when we did the book in 95, the FOP tried again to take the front line, and all they did was enrage people. So they went and they drove Maureen Faulkner up, brought her to the front line, and said, this huge Mumia machine, and that, you know, this is her, that she's battling it alone, you know, the white woman lying here. And I need y'all help. And that brought in the media, the things that they could not get, they brought it in. Even every time you see something about Mumia, and you see Maureen, it's the FOP. Maureen lives in LA. She don't know what the hell's going on up here. And when they can't do the battle with us, and you know, they go and get her.
Right. They pull
So
out.
you know, they put her in between us and the fight for Mumia, and we had to slap her ass to the back. You know, like what just has happened again. And you know, the power of this movement, this black movement, Black, and with all the people that's coming in, and the power, you know, that's happening here now. You know, every time they do this, like, you know, they had the governor sign this thing, it just, boom, the support is just growing more and more, because I don't care how you produce that lie, when you be consistent and persistent, and you have people who feel that way. You know, the guided students who all they wanted was, you know, commencement speaker. It blew up, it's all around the world. The pen has joined in, people around the world. In Oakland, Mumia was taught there for 15 years. FOP look at it, they bring Maureen's ass in, and bring Maureen in, and you know, and they knocked it down for a minute. But if you read the paper today, the Oakland teachers have put Mumia back on the curriculum. You know, and I'm saying, you know, all the tricks that they have tried, if you stay persistent, and with what it is that you gotta do, and you knock these people right on down. These sisters over here is trying to get a union in here, and which is needed, and the battle in the school. I'm telling you, stay persistent, keep going, and it's gonna be hard. Don't think it's gonna be easy. Some days you won't be anybody's damn self. And but the thing is, as long as you keep going and people back off for a minute, and you stay persistent when they see all these evil things that they do, people gonna continue to come. They're gonna continue to come. What I'm saying is, don't back down. And for people who think that, you know, we're not at a win with this, with Mumia's alive. Mumia, you hear him every day, and he's on an activity inside that prison doing exactly what we're doing here today. Organizing, grabbing people, go up to the business system and knock this motherfucker It'll be 33 years since they tried to kill Mumia in Simonstown. And you know, and what we're showing people on December the 9th is that Mumia still lives, this movement is still going, and it's growing bigger and bigger. You're not going to hear these things from the media and all, but we're going to bring you to the front line and let you see, not only through words, but through video. And all, you know, so, and on December the 13th, there's a youth panel, and all, you know, the resistance and all the magnificence of what youth do today, standing toe to toe with this government through good examples. And all for a lot of older people who just began to think that, you know, oh shit, it'll never happen. And all these are the people who's on the front line battling, you know, before. And all, but I'm saying, you know, I really thank the youth for being as persistent and going up against this government at this tender age now. And don't ever let these people swallow your fire down by thinking that, you know, oh, it can't be done. It is being done. And where's gonna be? Oh, I think you said everywhere. It's gonna be at Calvary Church, and it's gonna start at 6 o'clock with food. 6:15 is gonna be a video. 7 o'clock is gonna be one of the baddest legal updates that you've ever seen. Because I'm saying no bars hold. No bars hold. When you want to know what's happening, you want to find out what's happening. Then you'll also find out what is going on around the world in massive, you know, numbers of people rising up. I'm talking about the people. I'm talking about the black, the brown, the yellow, you know, everybody pulling up together and you know, to be in this fight. You know, so you know, in words of Baldwin too. December 13th will be at Unitarian Church from 11 o'clock to 4. Yes. And we're awarding, you know, youth in the movement and Ferguson and Mexico, you know, youth dealing with unions and things like that. And you know, we're honoring them and playing movies commentaries and you know, and then putting them up and, you know, bringing people into the whole thing.
This is what we talk. Well, this ain't no joke here. Mumia is, and you know, this question of competing symbols. Mumia is the symbol of resistance,
And
Maureen as the symbol, at least the front, for a kind of a white male, a machine of aggression and murder. Oh yeah. And they, you know, they signed Mumia's death warrant twice.
Right.
And he's off death row now.
Right.
And a lot has to do with her, believe me. I'm not exaggerating. But anybody else? Yes, go ahead. Shower White.
I just wanted to ask you, in light of like Baldwin placing this importance on artists as like the voice of African people, how do you see like the arts movement happening now? Because much of African art has been co-opted by mainstream white audiences and mainstream white media as well. So like, how do you see that like a black arts movement progressing for black people as opposed to the modification of like black life?
I think it's going to come out of the struggle that you all waging. You know, I know about close to a year ago, I theorized that in the youth movement we saw two streams coming together: the children of Occupy and the children of Trayvon. And I still think that's working. And I think now a kind of new synthesis in the struggle in Ferguson. And we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to the youth and people of Ferguson. Without question. You know, they have shown us all what is possible. But I think out of that, now I'm of the opinion that we can't go forward unless we correctly understand the great music that came before. And believe, you know, I think that nothing that has come since that great period of the 60s and 70s comes anywhere near it. And the reason I say, and just from the popular culture standpoint, I think we got to get back to Sly and the Family Stone. I am everyday people. Stand. You know what I'm saying? And let me tell you, these were homages to the Black Panther Party.
Yeah.
Curtis Mayfield, of course, the great Aretha Franklin. You can't go nowhere without her. And of course, I still, I like my man, Donny Hathaway, to be young, gifted, and black. That's where it's at. All of these things have to be connected to the movement going forward. But I think there are going to be new interpretations. Like Stevie Wonder's doing a tour, 11-city tour, the 25th anniversary of the album Songs of the Key of Life. And my man went to see it down at the COVID. He said it was unbelievable.
Yeah, it was down at Wells Fargo.
Yeah, Wells Fargo.
Yeah.
So, so I think I think going forward, awesome. Just like in every other period, art will come from the people. Now, another place that often is overlooked in the development of black art is the black church. Mm-hmm. And there's some serious singing and music going on in these churches now, right, that I would not underestimate, right, but that's the way I see it. And I think it all relates to the re-emergence of the spiritual life, the collective spiritual life of black people. And the big thing is we got to get this corporate money out of black life, out of black culture.
Hey, Tony.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry.
But better flat. Trade wins.
Trade wins. Okay.
That's where we are right now.
And that's why the whole concept, Kashara, as black studies, African American studies, as the intellectual arm or an intellectual arm of the black movement has to be reasserted. Anybody else? Yes.
Thank you so much for your reflection.
Yeah, tell me about it.
So this is a lot, but I've been struggling with this personally. You mentioned, I'm asking a lot about black population. And we have a tradition in which in America, the blacks are also constantly denied access to certain things. And it's real to us. If Baldwin argues something, Baldwin is arguing about black achievement, then you talk about it, psychological injury. Where is the celebration of black aspiration, especially among black women? And I'm hearing a lot of attacks on black women. And so I'm wondering, what's that thing for you like, or is it just about, was it about revenge in a kind of way? Yeah, I don't know. That's something that I've been struggling with.
This is a great question. I don't know what I can do to answer this question. But see, I think Baldwin's method and modality of critique, that black art must carve out and defend the space for its existence. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? For example, take Aretha Franklin. She's unequal. But without the black movement of that period, without the defending of her aesthetic by other artists and, well, of course, by Aretha's own magnificence, you don't have it. So the celebration of black art is both the audience for it, which defends it, which protects it, which through, we don't have radio stations, but through other venues and institutions can support and give support to the artists, you know what I'm saying? That's the way I would go about it. I think that's the way I would answer. Just from a Baldwin point of view, black art is not entertainment. Black art does not exist for popular consumption. If you want to go platinum, don't call it black art. If you want to be a billionaire, don't call yourself a black artist. You're not going to be that until you die, like Jean-Michel Basquiat, the great artist. Yeah. But no, I mean, black art exists when it is black art exists for black people and for black liberation. And that's, I think that was Baldwin's point.
I think that was the message. Even of Motown, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But certainly, in its highest level of consciousness, in, again, artists like, I said Aretha, I think Stevie Wonder, but then that whole body of jazz, everything from Coltrane, Miles Davis, then we could go on and on and on. But that reflects the spiritual, and then of course jump back into the church. And you got people, artists that won't perform outside of the church, like Mahalia Jackson, probably one of the greatest voices of our time, or I don't know whether you ever heard of Shirley Caesar.
Yeah.
Out of the caravan, it's out of Chicago. But that's the way I approach it. Go ahead, Darrell.
Yeah. Blues for Mr. Charlie. When did that come out?
1964.
That came out in '64, right? But I had saw him before that, and I saw him as being like an artistic version of Malcolm, but a revolutionary artistic version of Malcolm, because he was an artist, and that's how I perceived him. And I first saw him, that was like 1959, right around the same time Malcolm, when they had Malcolm on TV,
I think that's Blues for Mr. Charlie was his play by James Baldwin, which did get on Broadway. A lot of people said this was Baldwin's going from the integrationist movement, which term I don't really like that much, to a radical position.
Right.
And what he was saying is he was speaking through art and through this play,
right,
as Dawood was saying, to white America the way Malcolm X did.
Yeah.
As Malcolm said, he tried to keep it plain and direct. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead, Ty.
And Sister Pam just said, we found our really flowing to peace.
One of the things is to understand. This is one of Baldwin's things. To understand who Black people are. For Black people to understand who we really are. Because we're being sold an image of ourselves to us that is not really us.
Correct.
So Baldwin said, first of all, we have to know who we are. And one of the things that he implies, I like to use the word, resistance is a part of our cultural DNA.
Right.
It's not a mistake. Even I think about here at Temple, my situation. I'm not the only one that's been treated poorly and badly.
Right.
But it's just something in Black people. Don't even think about it. No, you're not going to do this to me.
That's right. That's right.
Correct.
Black, white, or otherwise.
That's right.
And the line in the sand is drawn. Now let's get it on. And there's no backing down. Now, of course, I'm from the same neighborhood as Mumia.
Right.
So that might have to look.
Right.
How? And hey, we gave a conference here at Temple a few years ago to study the life of Pam Africa. It was called Pam Africa, a revolutionary daughter of the dust. And that's her husband. He will confirm what I'm saying. That song, Ain't No Stopping Us Now. I went, how could I do less? Mumia, death row for 30 years. 33 years in jail.
33.
Writing, written 7 books, weekly, radio commentary. It's so bad, the governor and his cronies tried to pass a law to shut him down. Just couldn't kill him, and you can't silence him. I mean, it's just,
right.
but it's repeated over and
Over again.
over again. The police killed a lot of people. Why is Ferguson?
That's right.
Why is it Ferguson? You have to understand the cultural DNA of black folk. And you know something, Kashara? They threw everything at y'all to distract you, to destroy your confidence in yourselves. But your generation has risen up.
Right.
Yes.
And it's so interesting. It lets you know the celebrities are not the freedom fighters.
That's correct. That's
The
correct.
celebrities don't even care about us.
That's right.
They don't care about us. So now we will produce our own art. That happened in the 60s. That's why even you take a cat like Bob Dylan. He ain't no joke.
Right.
Bob Dylan is no joke.
Joke.
But what fires him up? The blues,
Right.
black culture.
Black culture.
Let me
Right.
tell you that. Beatles came over here.
Right. Right.
Where's
Right.
Lightning Hopkins?
Right.
Can you tell me where B.B. King lives?
Right.
Can I go down south and meet the real people? You know what I'm
Right.
saying? This is what. So,
Or can you see James Brown?
well, on the road, they are. And so, therefore, once American people realize that the pathways to working class liberation, to gay liberation, to women's liberation, to disabled, any kind of liberation, goes through the struggle for black liberation. Don't tell me what your position is on the trade union movement. I'm interested in that. But above everything else, what is your position on the black struggle?
Right.
Because if you're wrong on the black struggle, you ain't gonna be right
On the trade
union
movement.
struggle.
That's right.
Feminism. We'll get to that later, and I'll give you my position, but not tonight. You can't be. If feminism means women's liberation, and I'm not convinced of that, you cannot be right on the liberation of women unless you're right on black.
That's right.
Because ultimately what it becomes is a reconfiguration of whiteness.
That's right.
And on and on and on. And it's not because I'm black and I love black people, but I love black people because I love humanity and I want human liberation. And what is that mechanism? What is the advance guard? Has been, is now, and will be in the future. It is the struggle of black people. That is why you have to hear black people. You have to, you know, if I were white, I would humble myself and learn about black people.
That's right.
To hear, you know, just like a person like the Pam, anybody, you know, maybe myself, talk about the church. Don't understand black religion like Baba Vaping. How you gonna talk for 2 hours and Cornell West is sitting here,
Right.
over half the place, 60% of the people is black.
Yeah, you came to see him.
Yeah, and you gonna talk about black people and don't even know us.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? You said some good things, but overall, you were at the kindergarten level,
Right.
preschool.
Right.
But anyway, you know, listen, this has been more than, oh, I'm sorry, man.
I had to ask this question. I'm just wondering if you could maybe put us in James Baldwin's shoes for a minute in Greenwich Village back then. You mentioned Bob Dylan. I know he was around. You know, were they tight?
I don't think he knew, but see,
No.
Baldwin goes to the village in the mid-1940s.
40s.
Okay,
So,
long before that.
yeah.
Yeah.
But
Now, I'm also just curious about his general critical reception at the time, and where some of the other some of his other contemporaries fit in on the picture. Ishmael Reed comes to mind, and
Ishmael
perhaps
Reed.
Ralph Ellison.
Toni Morrison.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's a really long
this
question.
is a huge one. This is a huge, because the two big ones at the time that Baldwin merged are Richard Wright,
Right.
who in 1940 publishes this bomb called Native Son. And this character which still haunts American literature big at times. And the other one was Ralph Ellison, the great work Invisible Man.
Invisible Man.
So, I mean, I'm certain back then everybody thought the trajectory of the black novel would go in one of these ways. The kind of existential realism and the kind of psychological, I would say if you take Richard Wright, it's like Dostoevsky. If you take Ellison, it's more in the style of the French novel, blase, blase, blase. And so, but here then, coming out of nowhere is Baldwin.
Right.
I think in some ways you see both Richard Wright and Ellison in Baldwin. But I think that where Baldwin never sought a comfortable place. I think Richard Wright left the United States with his wife and kids to live in Paris, renounced his former radical positions, and sought to get paid, I think, in a lot of ways.
Right.
Ellison never produced another novel.
No.
And he was very cynical. He treated people like Toni Morrison very badly, who came to him as this iconic figure. Then here you have Baldwin. Baldwin was in Paris. He comes back to the United States, goes back to Paris about 1953. Then he comes back to the United States. I have to join the Civil Rights Movement.
Right.
Becomes a part of Civil Rights and Black Liberation Movement.
Right.
I think Baldwin transcends philosophically and artistically everything that preceded him, and nothing has superseded him up to this point. That's where I see Baldwin. And I think Amiri, I'm going to stop shutting, but Amiri Baraka, who is exceptional as an intellectual and activist, when he pays that homage
To Jimmy
Baldwin as the foundation, not as the father figure, but as the foundation, I think that said it all to me.
Right.
But we could talk more about all these things. Hey, y'all, I think we got to get out of here. You don't have to go home. We got to get out of here. All right, thank you, my brother. Hey, Ty, let me talk.